Under the damp, cold bridge, where Jack had nothing left but a torn backpack and his loyal German shepherd, he wished only for his fragile life not to be disturbed again. But at dawn, officials came to clear the area. No one asked where he would go. So he led Shadow into the forest through the gray rain, carrying the feeling of being left behind by the entire world, until he saw a mushroom-covered house standing still among the trees, as if it had been waiting for him for a very long time. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us.
Cold rain drifted through the city like a tired memory, turning sidewalks into mirrors of gray. Late afternoon light faded early, pressing the world into a narrow, colorless corridor where nothing seemed meant to last. Jack Walker was 46, tall but worn down, his frame still broad from years of military training, yet slightly hollowed by time and neglect. His dark brown hair had thinned at the temples and was threaded with gray, usually hidden beneath a frayed cap. A rough stubble clung permanently to his jaw, not from carelessness, but from a quiet indifference toward appearances. His face was angular, sharp-cheeked, with eyes that never fully rested, eyes trained to scan, assess, prepare. Jack was a former U.S. Marine, discharged more than a decade ago, carrying PTSD that had never softened with time. He wasn't violent. He didn't drink himself into oblivion. He simply failed, again and again, to exist comfortably among people who expected him to be over it. Beside him walked Shadow, a large black and white German shepherd, nearly 8 years old. The dog's coat was thick but dulled by age, his amber eyes alert yet calm. Shadow moved close to Jack's left leg, always matching his pace, as if trained to guard not a body, but a fragile mind. Jack had once believed discipline could replace belonging. After leaving the Marines, he worked construction, warehouse shifts, night security, jobs that valued silence and obedience. But the years wore him down. Panic attacks came without warning. Crowded rooms tightened his chest. Sudden noises pulled him back into places he no longer wanted to see. Employers grew impatient. Co-workers grew distant. Eventually, explanations stopped working. Jack wasn't fired loudly. He was simply not called back. The world didn't reject him outright. It just stopped making room. People often mistook his quiet for coldness. In truth, Jack avoided conversation because it required pretending. He hated small talk, hated the way people asked polite questions, and recoiled when answers became inconvenient. With Shadow, there was no such performance. The dog didn't care about Jack's silences or his sleepless nights. Shadow only watched, waited, stayed. That loyalty, steady and uncomplicated, was the last thread anchoring Jack to something resembling responsibility. He could neglect himself. He could not neglect the dog. There were days Jack considered disappearing entirely. Not dramatically, not violently, just slipping far enough away that no one would notice the absence. But then Shadow would look at him, ears slightly tilted, tail still, eyes searching his face. And Jack would remember something fundamental. If he vanished, the dog would wait. That knowledge alone kept him moving forward, step by step, without destination. By late afternoon, Jack reached the edge of the city, where concrete gave way to overgrown paths and damp trees. He had nowhere specific to go. Shelters were crowded, loud, unpredictable. Friends from his old life had families now, routines that no longer had space for him. Jack wasn't angry about it. He understood. Life kept moving. He was the one who had fallen out of step. Shadow paused, sniffing the wet ground, then looked back at Jack. Jack nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog. They would keep walking. That was the only plan left. Not hope, not recovery, just movement. Jack Walker was still alive, not because the world needed him, but because he had not yet found a reason to disappear. Rain fell without rhythm, heavy and relentless, the kind that soaked through layers and erased any sense of time. Jack woke beneath the bridge to the sound of engines and voices echoing against concrete. Orange safety vests moved like warnings in the gray light. The place where he and Shadow had stayed for weeks, hidden from most eyes, tolerated rather than accepted, was being cleared. A city worker approached, a stocky man in his early 30s with a round face, rain-speckled beard, and a tired professionalism that suggested he'd done this too many times. His voice wasn't cruel, just firm. The area was scheduled for removal. Jack needed to leave. No one asked where he would go. The question didn't exist in the script. Jack packed quickly, hands steady by habit, heart hollow. Shadow stood close, water beating on his black and white fur, ears swiveling at every sound. The dog was calm but alert, reading Jack more than the men around them. When Jack slung his worn pack over his shoulder, the worker nodded once, relieved to have no argument. Relief stung worse than anger. Jack turned away before it could settle into something heavier. The city offered nothing after that. Shelters were full. Cheap motels required deposits he didn't have. Each rejection was polite, efficient, final. By noon, the rain intensified, turning streets into slick channels. Jack made a decision not because it was wise, but because it reduced the number of eyes on him. He headed toward the national forest beyond the outskirts, trees instead of people, mud instead of concrete. Shadow followed without hesitation, paws splashing, tail low but steady. The deeper they went, the louder the rain seemed. Branches snapped underfoot. Wind moved through the canopy in sudden gusts. Somewhere between the first mile and the second, Jack's chest tightened. The smell of wet earth shifted, and his mind betrayed him. Metal, smoke, the concussive thud of memory slamming into the present. His vision narrowed. His breath hitched. He stopped, gripping the strap of his pack as if it could anchor him. Shadow pressed against his leg, solid and warm. "Jack," he whispered. "Jack Walker." He forced the words out, low and rhythmic. 2026. Forest. You're in the forest. He named what he could see. Trees, rain, his dog. The techniques had been drilled into him years ago. Grounding, orientation, breath, but they never worked cleanly. They worked enough. He waited until the shaking eased, until the noise in his head receded to a dull roar. Stopping entirely was dangerous. He knew that. He moved because movement kept the edges from closing in. They found a faint trail leading uphill, narrower than the others, less traveled. Moss-covered rocks like old wounds healed over. The rain softened to a steady pour. Jack's boots were soaked through. His socks clung cold to his feet. He didn't complain. Complaints were for people who expected relief. As dusk crept in, he spotted a dark shape among the trees, a structure swallowed by growth. Up close, it revealed itself as a small wooden cabin, half hidden, its walls and roof layered with thick clusters of pale mushrooms. They bloomed from seams and corners, caps overlapping like scales. The place looked abandoned, not ruined, preserved by something strange and alive. Jack hesitated. The cabin was not safety. It was a pause. But the rain was worsening and the light was going. He guided Shadow beneath the overhang near the door, just enough to escape the worst of the downpour. The dog shook once, then sat, eyes fixed on Jack. Jack leaned against the wall, breathing shallowly, letting the cold seep in to keep him present. He didn't sleep. He simply stayed. Night settled around them, and for now, the forest did not ask them to leave. The rain never fully stopped, but sometime before dawn, it softened into something heavier and more intimate, a steady drumming that pressed against Jack's skull like a hand refusing to let go. The cabin loomed close now, no longer just a silhouette, but a presence. Mushrooms clung to it in thick, pale layers, ivory, gray, faintly yellow, spilling from the roofline, climbing the walls, blooming around the doorframe as if the house itself had been sealed inside a living skin. They smelled faintly sweet and damp, like old wood kept too long in the dark. Jack didn't step inside because he believed it was safe. He stepped inside because his legs shook, his vision tunneled, and the idea of taking another step felt impossible. Shadow followed immediately, nails clicking once against the warped floor before going still, his broad body blocking the draft behind them. The interior was dim, lit only by the thin gray light leaking through cracks in the boards. Mushrooms had claimed the IE inside too, pushing up through the floor in small clusters, clinging to the lower walls like frozen breath. The air was cold and wet, but it was still. Stillness mattered. Jack leaned his back against the wall and slid down until he was sitting, boots stretched out, spine aching from the slow collapse. Shadow pressed into his side without being asked, solid and familiar, his black and white fur matted from rain, his breath warm against Jack's wrist. The dog was 7 now, his muzzle just beginning to gray, eyes still sharp, still watchful. He had learned long ago when to move and when to simply be weight and warmth. The memories came anyway. Not all at once, never all at once, but in fragments that cut deep. A flash of metal, the sound of rain turning suddenly into something else, the echo of shouting that didn't belong to the forest. Jack's chest tightened hard enough that he had to brace his hands on the floor. He tried the grounding again, whispering under his breath, but the words tangled. His name felt distant. The years slipped away from him. His body remembered faster than his mind could catch up. He bowed his head, jaw clenched, breath shallow and uneven. Shadow lifted his head and nudged Jack's forearm, a small insistence. Jack curled his fingers into the dog's fur, gripping like a lifeline, nails digging in, just enough to feel something real. He didn't fight it the way he used to. There was no energy left for that. The fight had drained out of him somewhere between the bridge and the trees, washed away mile by mile in cold rain. His muscles trembled, then sagged. His thoughts slowed, breaking apart into loose pieces that no longer connected. He became aware, dimly, that he was shivering, that his clothes were still soaked, that the floor was hard and unforgiving. He told himself he should move, should check the door, should clear a space. The thoughts arrived without force, like suggestions offered too late. Shadow shifted, curling closer, placing his head across Jack's thigh. The weight anchored him. The sound of rain on the mushroom-covered roof blurred into a constant low roar. Jack's eyes burned, then closed. He didn't plan to sleep. He didn't prepare for it. His body simply shut down, as if a switch had been thrown without permission. The last thing he registered was the smell of wet wood and earth, and the steady rise and fall of Shadow's breathing. The memories fractured, then went dark. Jack slept not because he felt safe, but because there was nothing left in him to stay awake. Morning arrived quietly, without ceremony. Jack opened his eyes to the dim interior of the cabin, the air thick with the sour, earthy smell of mushrooms. For a few seconds, nothing made sense. The ceiling was too low. The light was wrong. His body felt heavy, unresponsive, as if it did not fully belong to him yet. Then his chest rose again, and again. Breath. Real, shallow, but present. His heart was beating, slow, stubborn, undeniable. Shadow lay pressed against his side, the dog's flank warm, his steady breathing a rhythm Jack clung to. The night had passed. He had not died in his sleep. The realization did not bring relief. It brought something quieter and more unsettling. Proof. Jack sat up slowly, dizziness washing through him in a dull wave. His joints protested, stiff from cold and damp. He ran a hand over his face, fingers catching in his beard, dark, streaked with gray now, untrimmed for weeks. His hair was flattened on one side, sweat damp despite the chill. He looked older in moments like this, the years compressing into his posture. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, amber eyes scanning the room before settling back on Jack. 7 years old, broad-chested, scar faintly visible along one hind leg from a long-ago accident. Loyal to the point of gravity. Leaving did not occur to Jack as a first impulse. There was no rush left in him. Instead, he reached out and brushed aside a cluster of mushrooms growing near his knee, just enough to clear a small patch of floor. The caps crumbled easily, releasing a faint powdery scent. Beneath them, the wood was surprisingly solid. He shifted his weight and felt it then, a soft give, a subtle movement that didn't belong. Jack froze. Years of training surfaced without thought. He pressed down again carefully. One plank shifted, loose at the edge. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but focus. He pried at the board with his fingers until it lifted free, revealing a shallow compartment beneath the floor. Inside lay objects arranged with an almost deliberate care. A weathered notebook wrapped in oilcloth, a pair of tarnished Marine Corps medals, discharge papers folded and refolded until the creases were white, several black and white photographs, and a worn leather dog collar, cracked with age, the name nearly rubbed away. Jack stared at the contents for a long moment, throat tightening. These were not trash. They were remains. The notebook drew him first. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting tight and uneven, as if written by someone who hadn't slept enough. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Hale, a former U.S. Marine who had lived in this cabin more than 40 years earlier. The entries were dated sporadically, filled with notes about isolation, sleepless nights, sudden panic, and a constant awareness of his own thoughts turning against him. Hale wrote plainly without romance, about the urge to disappear, about rehearsing endings in his head. Jack recognized the affiche cadence instantly. It was the language of someone surviving minute by minute. One passage stopped him cold. I dug a hole in the woods today, not for anything specific, just to know it was there. But my dog sat by the door the whole time. If I die, he will wait. Jack closed the notebook, hands trembling despite his effort to stay still. Shadow had moved closer, sensing the shift in him, nose resting against Jack's knee. Jack looked down at the dog, then back at the hidden space beneath the floor. A man like him had lived here once. A Marine, broken in similar ways. He had stood in the same room with the same thoughts circling, and somehow he had not died. The cabin did not feel empty anymore. It felt inhabited by something unfinished. Jack did not return to town because he wanted to. He did it because Shadow needed medication and because the papers under the floor had planted a quiet, practical thought in his head that would not leave him alone. The road back felt longer than it had any right to be. Pavement replaced mud, engines replaced wind, and with each step closer to people, Jack's shoulders tightened. Shadow walked close to his knee, leash looped loosely around Jack's wrist, his presence a steady reminder to keep moving forward and not inward. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, a low beige building with peeling paint. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. The woman at the counter was in her late 40s, tall and slightly stooped, with prematurely gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read, Linda Parker. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind, the eyes of someone who had learned to read exhaustion quickly. She glanced at Jack's worn jacket, his unshaven face, then down at Shadow. The look softened. She spoke gently, asked simple questions, didn't push. Shadow received his medication, a mild antibiotic for a paw infection Jack had been treating as best he could. Linda gave Jack an extra week's worth without comment, just a brief nod that said she understood more than she would ever say out loud. From there, Jack walked to the county administrative office. The building was old, bricks stained by decades of rain, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He stood in line behind people with folders and clipboards, feeling like an intruder in a place built for those with plans. When his turn came, the clerk barely looked up at first. Mark Evans, mid-30s, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a receding hairline that made him look permanently worried. His voice was flat, procedural. Jack slid the address across the counter, written carefully on a scrap of paper. Mark's fingers moved across the keyboard. He frowned slightly, then nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. The property, he explained, had been abandoned for years. Back taxes unpaid, no utilities connected. The forest cabin wasn't condemned, but it might as well have been. Fungal overgrowth scared people off. Cleanup costs alone were enough to deter any interest. The county had listed it at a price so low it bordered on absurd, just to clear it from their records. Mark finally looked up at Jack. "You thinking of buying?" he asked, not curious so much as puzzled. Jack hesitated. He thought of the journal, of Thomas Hale's handwriting, of the sentence about the dog waiting by the door. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am." The process was simple. Too simple. A few signatures. A small payment scraped together from what little Jack had left. No ceremony. No congratulations. When Mark slid the papers back across the counter, his expression shifted. Not warmth, but something close to respect. "Place hasn't been kind to people," he said. "Just so you know." Jack nodded. Kindness was not what he was looking for. Walking out of the building, papers folded into his jacket, Jack felt no rush of hope, no sense of starting over. The town looked the same as it always had, indifferent, busy, unconcerned with whether he stayed or left. Shadow trotted beside him, tail moving slowly, medicine rattling softly in Jack's pocket. The decision settled in Jack's chest, not as relief, but as weight. A deliberate weight, the kind that keeps you grounded. He did not buy the cabin to build a better life. He bought it because it did not ask him to leave, because no one had stood in front of it with a uniform or a clipboard telling him he did not belong. Because in a world that had quietly erased him, this place, rotting, overgrown, forgotten, had simply remained. And for now, that was enough. Jack turned back toward the forest, toward the cabin waiting in silence, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was disappearing. Jack did not begin treatment because he believed it would fix him. He began because someone before him had tried. The journal lay open on the table most mornings, Thomas Hale's tight handwriting a quiet witness. Jack read a page at a time, never more. When the words grew too familiar, panic, sleeplessness, the pull toward nothing, he closed it and went outside. The cabin still wore its living skin. Mushrooms climbed the walls in layered fans, pale and stubborn. Jack cleared them slowly, section by section, using a borrowed scraper and his bare hands. He kept one patch intact on the north wall, a rough oval left untouched. Not as a shrine, as proof. Proof that something could grow over pain without erasing it. He drove into town once a week for appointments. The clinic was small, neutral, deliberately unremarkable. His therapist, Dr. Emily Carter, was in her early 40s, average height, with short auburn hair and a face that held steady lines rather than softness. She dressed plainly, spoke plainly, and did not lean forward in manufactured empathy. Years earlier, she had lost a brother to suicide. It had shaped her work into something careful and unsentimental. She listened without interrupting, asked questions that landed cleanly and never promised recovery. When Jack told her he didn't expect to get better, she nodded. "Then let's aim for today," she said. It was the first goal that hadn't felt like a lie. At home, time slowed into small tasks. Clearing a doorway, fixing a hinge, drying Shadow's paws after rain. Shadow was older now, 8, maybe 9, his muzzle whitening, his steps measured. He slept more, rose slower, and leaned into Jack with a heavier trust. Jack noticed everything. He learned to pace their days to the dog's breathing, not his own thoughts. When memories surged, he named objects aloud. When nights tightened, he sat with his back to the wall and counted Shadow's breaths. Living on, he discovered, was not an idea. It was repetition. The cabin did not heal him. It did not soothe him with false quiet. Storms still rattled the roof. Cold still seeped through seams. But no one knocked to move him along. No clipboard, no deadline. He paid the taxes when he could, patched what he could reach, left the rest. The mushrooms returned where he had cleared them, slower now. He learned which ones to remove and which to leave, how the wood beneath stayed solid when he was patient. Some mornings he stood in the doorway and felt nothing at all. That, too, counted. Shadow aged in visible increments, a limp on damp days, a sigh before lying down. Jack adjusted. He lifted the dog into the truck when needed, spread blankets near the stove, warmed food with care. He talked to Shadow without embarrassment, narrating plans that went no further than sunset. The future remained an unpromised thing. Jack did not call the cabin a place of healing. He called it a place that did not drive him away. That distinction mattered. On one clear afternoon, Jack reread a passage he had avoided. Thomas Hale had written about choosing to stay, not out of hope, but because the dog waited. Jack closed the journal and looked at the patch of mushrooms he had left on the wall. He touched the edge, then withdrew his hand. Outside, Shadow stirred and wagged once, slow and certain. Jack stepped into the light, shouldered the day's weight, and did what he had learned to do best. He stayed. Jack never called it an invitation. He left the gate unlatched and the light on. Word traveled the way it always did in places where people were running out of places, quietly, sideways, carried by half-truths and careful hope. The cabin did not become a center. There were no signs, no schedule, no rules written down. Some nights a man appeared at dusk and asked nothing, eyes fixed on the ground. Other nights two came together and left before morning without a word. Jack learned names when they were offered and did not press when they were not. He offered soup, a dry floor, a chair by the stove, nothing more. Shadow greeted each arrival with a measured wag, his body broad and calm, gray now spreading across his muzzle, his presence setting the tone. Stay if you need, go when you can. The first to linger was Mike Rourke, early 50s, tall and hollowed out, with a jaw that clenched like it was holding something in place. His beard grew unevenly, as if he forgot it was there, and his left hand shook when he tried to light a cigarette. He had been Army, not Marines, and spoke in clipped sentences shaped by years of biting back what didn't fit. A roadside explosion had taken his hearing on one side and his patience on the other. He slept sitting up the first night, boots on, back to the wall. By the third, he lay down and slept for 4 hours straight. He left at dawn with a nod and a note folded small on the table. Jack did not open it until evening. Then came Luis Alvarez, late 30s, shorter, compact, with close-cropped black hair and a scar running from ear to collarbone that made his smile tilt. He laughed easily, too easily, a reflex that arrived before the pain did. He had been a medic and still carried the habit of checking wrists, eyes, breath. He stayed 2 nights, cooked breakfast once, and cleaned mushrooms from the porch without being asked. When he left, he hugged Shadow first, then Jack, brief and firm, like men do when they don't trust. Their voices. There were others. Sam Whitaker, quiet, red-haired, skin burned by years outdoors, who stared at the fire until his eyes watered and said nothing at all. Evan Price, barely 40, heavyset, face soft with exhaustion, who cried once in the middle of the night and apologized in the morning. Jack listened when listening was needed and stepped outside when it was not. He did not offer therapy. He offered presence. He did not tell them it would get better. He told them where the water was and how to keep the stove from smoking. Jack kept his routines. Therapy once a week. Mushrooms cleared slowly, a little at a time, the patch on the north wall left intact. Taxes paid when he could. Shadow's walk shortened, paced to the dog's breath. Some mornings Jack woke with the familiar weight in his chest. Some mornings he woke and simply noticed the light. Neither meant anything more than the other. Living on remained an act, deliberate and unglamorous. One evening, as the sun lowered into the trees, Jack sat on the porch with Shadow's head resting against his boot. The forest breathed. No one was inside. He thought of Thomas Hale, of the sentence about the dog waiting by the door. Jack did not tell himself he had been saved. He did not claim victory. He acknowledged a smaller truth. He had opened his eyes after a night that could have taken him. He was still breathing. Shadow was still here. Behind him stood a house that did not drive people away. That was enough to keep the light on.